All right, yeah. So in today's lecture, we're talking about strings, string operations. And why is that? Because we've already looked at strings earlier, right? And so we might say that why are we reviewing that? And the goal of today's lecture is to understand how can we read data from external files and web pages. So that's the focus of today's lecture. That is to read files and to read the data that's stored in those files from sources outside of the Python environment that we have looked at until now, right? What we've done until now is that created some objects within this Python environment and done something with them. Although you have seen that we have provided you with some files, some external files, but then we were also providing you with the utility files. That means the code that involved reading those external files was already there in those programs. And now is the time when you will be writing your own code to read those files into Spider and then manipulate it, extract information from that, and we'll see all of that today. So first of all, we'll begin reviewing strings. And like the question arises, why do we need to do that? Well, a short answer to that question is because most of the data exists in that form now, right? Most of the data, most of the programming revolves around that in today's age, I would say, because most of the data is either on Facebook, on Twitter, and we are trying to extract that, we are trying to derive things from that and so on. So that's why this is so important, like opening and reading files, reading the content in those files and doing things with that, right? Writing your program around that. So which is why we are reviewing string operations, how to get files on your computer into your code and then work with it, opening and closing of files, writing files, and then accessing files across the web. Now for this one, we'll be a little bit like, I would say, limited in the sense that we will just look at static web pages. So I'll show you what we mean. But mostly like throughout this lecture and even like going forward, we will be reading like text files, the txt files that are saved on your computer, and so we'll be reading those. All right, so let us begin. This was like an overview of today's lecture. And by the way, everybody can hear me, right? Before I just forgot to ask. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Askar. All right, so let's begin with string operations. And this also goes back to one of the very common questions that has been asked like ever since homework 4 opened on Submiti, that many of you are not getting the exact same output as you're getting on Spider. And reason being that you're not using this dot strip. And we're going to understand why this is so important. Let's look at this string. So by default, this dot strip works on strings. And we always use it, and you should make it like make a note somewhere that whenever you're reading user input, you should always include dot strip. So I'm going to show you like different ways of using dot strip. For example, with this one, I'm using X. Let's say this is my string dot strip, and then the default, the dot strip it looks something like this, which means it removes spaces or space characters on either side of the string. So like even before we start going into the lecture, whenever you see something like this on your or on Submiti output, like \r or like some extra characters that are introduced in your string, you know that you can use dot strip to get rid of that because it's a space character. It's like a space character in Linux, and because Submiti runs on that. So that's why you see those, and you can get rid of them with just by using this default dot strip. It's going to remove all spaces. All right. So in addition to that, what we can do is we can like say go and do dot strip using some substring. For example, in this case, I want to strip this string either side. So that means I want to remove this substring from either side of the string. Let's see how that happens. So all I have to do is go and I'm telling the interpreter, go and remove red and then exclamation mark from either side of the string, right? See what happens. And so obviously red exclamation mark got removed from either side, right? In addition to this, I can also use two more, I think, I don't know if we have it in the lecture notes. Okay, let's focus on this one first. If you have like this red exclamation mark and you know that this exists on either side, then only we can do this, right? If this does not exist on either side, then obviously that won't be removed. For example, let's say there is this string. Okay, let me do this. And then I'm saying go and do x dot strip red exclamation mark. And so of course this left side will be removed, but because this red exclamation mark is not on the end, on the other end of this the string, that will not be removed, and that was quite obvious. Another thing to notice here is that all this dot strip is looking for is these characters, and it's not looking for that sequence. And that's what the second example is showing us. For example, if I just like use another permutation, I would say, of the same like letters and characters, let's see what happens, right? Let's see what happens when I run this code. All right, so surprise, even then red exclamation mark is removed, right? So the thing here, what I'm trying to like emphasize is that it doesn't matter what the arrangement of those letters are, but they have to exist on this end. So for example, if I did something like this, let me do this, just ed and exclamation mark, nothing happened to the string. Why? Because this ed exclamation, like none of these characters that I'm asking it to go and like dot strip, none of these characters are on this end or this end of the string. So it didn't do anything, right? Those characters have to exist there, like then only it will remove, otherwise it cannot remove. Like even like if, because the character on the leftmost side was missing. Now sometimes this thing might happen. For example, we have red and red. I don't want to remove the red on the right hand side. I just want to remove it on the left hand side, right? So let me see what I can do. Notice I've added an L with the strip. So I'm saying to do a left strip. Okay, let's do this. Notice that this like left side has, left side red is gone, but you still have the one on the right hand side, right? Let us assume we want to keep the left side red, but we want to remove the right side red. Then instead of L strip, you can do an R strip. And again, let's execute the entire thing. And as you can see, the red exclamation mark on the right hand side is gone. Okay, so these are two variants, I would say, L strip and R strip of dot strip. Okay, let's look at more kind of variations of dot strip itself. Okay, going back to the question that's coming up again and again in, like I think it came up in homework 3 as well, and now homework 4, problem 1. And that is to do with the space characters. Now, what are these space characters? Let's say I'm doing something like this, right? And I have, let's say, a \n and lots of space here, and a \t \n, right? And space and \t again. All right, so this is a string. And the string has these escape characters, and you know these escape characters represent some kind of spacing in your string. So when you're doing something like this, like x dot strip, and then the default, like not giving it any argument there, let's see what happens. All right, so all these characters, these \n's and \t and \n, all of that is gone. And it is like similar to that, if there is a \r, as I said, it comes up like those are known as carriage returns, and they come up on submittee because of Linux. So if there is something like this, even that will be removed if you're using dot strip. So whenever you see that issue, just go ahead and use dot strip. Now I'll show you something in addition to this. So let's assume we have this string again. And instead of like using this default dot strip, I'm explicitly going ahead and using this, right? And you might argue that this is also some kind of spacing here, although it's like within quotes, but I'm saying go and remove the space. Okay, so let's see whether it does that or not. Well, you can see that the \n's and the \t and everything like this, the escape characters still remain in my string. And why is that? That is because here you're explicitly telling it to remove that one space character within the quotes. So it's going to match that space character only, which means if there was this like these space characters on either side, then it will remove those. That is fine, but it won't identify these escape characters as being some kind of spacing. The default, the Python default dot strip does that because it knows that like it has to remove every possible space character. So when I execute this, it is going to remove those backslash n's and backslash t's. This is the fundamental difference between using this, and I noticed many of you were using it. What the issue that might come up here when you're using this and you don't want any kind of space characters to be counted is that if there is a backslash n and a backslash t which is not quite visible in your input, that will be counted and you will get like wrong output. That's like a semantic error. So depending on the usage, depending on what you require your program to do, make sure that you're using the right argument in the dot strip. All right, any questions, doubts before we move on? Okay, I don't see any questions, so that's fine. This is quite straightforward, of course, but then this was a common problem that was coming up again and again, and so that's why I wanted to talk about it. Like this dot strip with quotes is different from this default dot strip. Just remember that. All right, so let's look at like one more. So this is x dot split. We already talked about this, right? Let's talk about dot strip is done. Dot split. Yeah, let's take this. And again, we've talked about this, but now we'll be using this a lot. So that's why we are repeating things here. And let's assume this is my string x. And now I'm going to use dot split. And dot split, if you remember, it creates a list. And that's useful for us. Why? Because we know how to work with lists. We know how to use lists with loops. And so this is the most convenient data structure that we use whenever we are reading in strings. So that's what we're going to do. Let's do that. So whenever I say x dot split, right? So this like by default, let's see what it does, right? Let's see what it does first. Okay, so this is what it does. By default, it splits by these spaces. Just notice there were spaces like these space characters within my string, right? And when I said a default dot split, it's split by those. Now let me also show you like an additional point here. What happens if I had like go, between go I had like a backslash t, right? Just look at this example. Just like pay attention to this example, and I don't want you to confuse with like it's not a TO, but it's a backslash T. And let's see what happens here. Okay, so notice this G alone here, right? Earlier it was like a complete go, right? But now G and O are separated because I have a space character in between, which is a backslash T. So when we're using, again, similar to dot strip, when we're using this default dot split, the default Python dot split will take these space characters into account. And this means that I'm telling it to go and split by space, right? So I'm saying go and split by space. And it includes all these space characters, right? So space characters. So it's going to split by those characters as well if they exist in your string. Now, again, similar to dot strip, you can specify that you don't want those characters to split your like string, but you want it to split by like, let's say one space. So wherever that one space comes in, you just like want to split it by that. Let's see what happens. Notice this backslash t is there in your string because you explicitly went ahead and said you just want to split by that particular like one space and nothing else. So you don't want to include those special characters. You want those special characters to be retained. And so they are retained in your dot split. But regardless, in both cases, the important thing to notice here is that you will have this list created. And this is important because these are like different strings or different elements of my string now, or sorry, of my list now. And so I can work with it, right? Okay, let me show you more dot split variations. So for example, let's say I'm saying go and split by certain substring, right? And let me remove this. We understand this now, right? So I'm saying go and split by, let's say red exclamation mark. Let's see what it does. Okay, now notice this was the original string here, right? And I said go and split by this red. So think of this as that it's going to remove those characters from my string and split exactly at that point where it encounters that string or that substring. So for example, it encountered this red exclamation mark right here. And so it just like stopped there, right? It just stopped there and created this one element of my list. And then the next element started right after that, and then went ahead until it encountered that particular argument that you provided as your substring. And it created this list that has all these elements. And notice, like, it even has like this last space here, because like, and it has like nothing, right? It's just like signifying that this was the last thing, and that it has nothing in it, not even a space. So this is how the dot split happens. You can specify what do you want to split by. And now the question arises, why is this so important? How, like, why are we specifying go and split by this thing? Why is this important? Well, this is important because we'll see today that the data that we're using comes in like text form, and we consider it like as a string. And if that string is like separated by certain things, for example, let's say the string is separated by commas. So then we can say go and split by comma and then create a list of all those elements. Or maybe it's like, let's say, for example, in this case, let's say the data is all separated by this exclamation mark. So then we know a way to kind of create a list of those elements. And that's the whole point of using this like dot split. It depends on how the data comes to us, and based on that, we can decide how to utilize it and how to extract information, useful information from that. Because most of the times the data will be saved in a certain format. And most of the TXT files have data saved like by separating it by some delimiter, right? So sometimes if you see the word delimiter, it means you're like the data separator in a certain way, right? For example, we are considering this exclamation mark to be the delimiter. Similar to that, we'll see examples, so you don't have to kind of memorize it, but you'll see that. All right, so this is what this section is talking about. Split returns the strings before and after the delimiter string in a list. So that delimiter could be anything. For example, we saw it could be an exclamation mark, it could be the substring red, it could be anything. It could be like the space, the default space, it could be the space that's provided by you. So it depends, depending on the problem. All right, so that was dot strip, dot split, and finally let's review this dot find, because again we are going to use this a lot, right? So we have x. Let's say we are saying x dot find. Let's look at this example here. All right, let me recreate it. I don't remember we updated it or something. All right, so this, if you remember, finds the occurrence of a substring or a character, whatever you provide here. And it's going to find the first occurrence because like you have many of those. Okay, and let's see what it does. So this is essentially going to return the index of the very first element of the substring. So you know where the substring is starting. If I execute this, notice this is 9. And let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is 9, right? And so this is the index of that R, essentially. This is what it finds. Now, let's assume we don't want to find this red. I want to look whether there exists another red after this red. And so I just want to skip that. Okay. So one way of doing that is that I can specify, like dot find allows more parameters there. For instance, I can specify where to start. For example, I know that my red exists at 9. So let me begin after that. I want to search after that. So I'll begin at position 10, and then I have to specify until what position do I want to search. Let's say I want to search until 15, and let's see what this returns. Well, it returns -1 because it seems there is no red in that range. There is no red. So dot find, if you remember, if it does not, it's not able to find that in your string, then it's going to return a -1, which is in fact a useful result. Because sometimes you're just trying to test whether that exists or not. So you can even like have this in your logic. If it returns a -1, then do something, otherwise do something else, right? And so if we like increase this, or let's try doing this. All right, so what did it do? Obviously dot find just requires like 1 is the required argument. The rest of them are like, excuse me. Rest of them are like optional. So it's saying begin at 10 and go until the end. And so the next red it found is at 23. So this is how this works. Let me go back and check if I missed anything. All right. Yeah, and this is also important because sometimes we get caught up with that. Let's see. Now, this is like .find is going to find the exact occurrence of that substring read, which means it's case sensitive. So if I'm doing x.find and then this is like uppercase, but there is no uppercase, it's not going to by itself like convert it to the other case. So you will have to take care of that. Either do a dot lower for both the string and .find and then go ahead and find that, or like apply something else, most likely like a dot upper or dot lower, and this should work. Excuse me, let me just grab water. All right, sorry about that. Okay, another thing is sometimes we are interested in finding, so like kind of try to get a true or a false, whether that exists in a string or not, right? If a substring exists in a string or not. One quick way of finding that is simply just do the substring and then the in operator and then in X. So this is just like testing whether this exists in X or not. So for example, it returns a true. And of course, this is case sensitive as well because it's matching like the exact string with the strings within that like bigger string. For instance, if I do red in red, it's going to return a false because there is no uppercase red in there. This is also useful because as I said, we'll be dealing with TXT files, we'll be dealing with this string type data format a lot. And so that's why we need to kind of review these and because we'll be using them a lot going forward. All right, questions. Lenny's, your question is, what if we wanted to split two things like the word red and the spaces? Okay, so you will have to use dot split and then dot split again, and then depending on the order, or do it like in 2 lines or something, or you'll have to write more code. So that's what we are getting at. There are 2 types of files that you'll be reading, and there is like a certain pseudocode that exists for doing that. So you will have to figure out the second one, depending on, maybe you'll have to write a few lines of code. There is no like default of like using dot split, dot split. All right, so moving to the actual topic for today, that's opening and reading .txt files. We're beginning with like a very simple txt file, and I have it open here. So I just like copied it from one of the websites and pasted it here. So it's like some lines of text essentially, and we're going to understand how to read this. Now going back to our, remember the images example where I said that either go and directly read it, either go and specify the path of your file or save it in your working directory. So I've saved it in my working directory, and the same rule or the same logic applies to TXT files. Why? Because they are also external to your Python environment. So you'll have to think about how to read that in. Okay, so let me show you how to read that in. As I said, I've saved it in this folder, this abc.txt. I've saved it here, exactly here. Now, there are many ways of opening and reading files, and we are going to follow one of them. And one of them is like use the open function. Let me show you how we do that. So let me create this variable f equals, and then I'll do open. That's it. And then specify the name of your file. Okay, let's see how do we do that. I know the name of my file is abc.txt. Let me show you this here, right? This is the name of my file. So I'm just like specifying that exactly here within quotes. So the name of the file is a string type, as you can see. And there is an optional second argument with this open function. If you don't specify it, it's going to take as read, which is like R, right? It is going to take this as R. And I think we have this in the lecture notes as well. Yeah, and this has to be like string, of course. Right? So by default, it is R, but there are other options available as well. We are going to show like use one of them, which is like W. W means write. And then there is A means append. So append we don't use as much, but R is the one that we use the most because we are reading most of the times. That's what we're doing, at least in this course. And so if you don't specify anything here, by default, it is read, right? Let me write it. Default is read, right? So I'm not specifying anything. That means I'm just trying to read my file. Okay, so let me just execute this. If when you're executing this, you get an error, that means the file does not exist in your working directory, and so you should save it either in the working directory or specify the entire path in this string. And so it's going to find it, find the path and wherever the file is. So either one of them is fine. Now, notice nothing happened, right? I just opened it and then that's fine. So what we have to do is, in addition to this, like similar to other methods that we have opened, we know that the contents of this file are now in this variable f. This is what this means. Now we have to go and read it. Let me show you how do we read it. So there are like methods to read the lines of the file. So the first one is read line. And again, you can either do directly f.readline or save it in a variable and print that variable. Let me do one of them, f.readline. Of course, try to, I would say, play with it more and see what happens. So f.readline is going to read the first line of abc.txt. Okay, so let me print line now. Okay, so this was the first line. If you look at it, this was my first line here. Let me go back to the, in the study ward, in this colleagues, this thing until attention. So that was my first line, and that's what it read. So read line reads one line. Okay, so having done that, there is another, I would say, method that reads all the contents in one go. Let's say we want to read all the contents in one go and not like line by line. So for that, I can do something like this, s equals f.read, and that's it, right? So when I do f.read, the contents will be saved in s, and I'm going to print s or directly use it, whichever you feel is good for you. All right, so here's the thing. Now notice what I did just now. Now the first thing I did was, like, I saved in a variable f, like the contents of my abc.txt, and then I created another variable line, and I saved .readline, the output of .readline in that, and printed it. So of course it printed the first line. Now what happened here when I said f.read and I said reads the contents of the entire file? It started from the second line. Now notice it started reading from here until the end, right? In the first experiment until location. So here's the thing. If we are reading this using these methods, read line and read, it reads line by line, which means that once you read this line, f.readline, it stopped like there. The execution stopped there. And when you said like next, go and read, the pointer is pointing after this line. And so it started reading after that. Let me show you again something. If I do this again, let me do this again. And in fact, this entire thing again. And let me do that here. And I said print line. Okay, let me do it again. Print line. I did read line again. It's not printing anything, right? So it's not doing anything at all. And so what's wrong with it? What is wrong with it? Let's see what's there in this read line. Well, there is this empty string in the read line. And so that's why my print line is not printing anything, because there is nothing to print. And so why is that? The fact that like we are using these methods, the way these methods read line and read work is that they act as pointers. So they point on the first line, and then like the number of times you execute that, they're going to keep pointing to the other lines and eventually reach the end of the file. So when we did f.read, it actually went to the end of the file, and you can tell that after that word location, there isn't anything in the file. And so when I'm doing read or read line again and again, it's just giving me this empty string. All right, so what's the way to get back to like the opening part and then like start reading it again? One way is to go and close it. And the way to do that is, let me do it. So f.close, and I just do that, f.close. And so this closed the file, and then I can open it again and start reading. And so the read line and the read will work in exactly the same way as it did earlier. So this is only with the functions read line and read. This is what happens when we use them, because they start pointing to these specific lines. And so we have to deal with that. Now I'm going to show you how we can work our way through this, like not using read line and read. I mean, use it whenever you want, but like this can be tedious at times that you like have to close it again and again. And so we don't need to kind of do that because we just need the contents, not really read them. We just can get the contents and save them in some variable and then use them and not really read them, because this is like literally taking it into reading it into a variable. And then because the way you read something is like once you've read one page, you don't go and read again. And so that's why it's like moving in that sense. So that this is how read line and read work. But what is our way around this thing? Let's look at that. Right, so this is something that we already talked about, read and read line. How will we read the contents of a file? How will we use it in our program? Let's focus on that now, right? So let me again do this. And of course, open is something that we will be using a lot, right? And just open it. And then the other thing that you can do is just like loop through the contents of that and just like get the output. You don't really need to go and read it as such. So what we can do is for variable in f, this is one way, just print that variable. And this is our way around that, not use like read or read line, because who's going to like close and close them again, like close and open them again. All right, let's do this. So as you can see, I'm getting like somewhat similar. Yeah, I mean, internally it's not doing the same thing, but that's fine for me. I don't really care as long as I'm getting the output, because I'm going to use these the contents of my file anyways, right? So that this is the convention. Another way is you can directly go and do this. Instead of like saving it in a variable, you can directly write this, right? So you can directly write this and it's going to still print whatever you need. All right, so that was like a bit of technicality, but that's fine as long as we can get the contents of a file and we can use them. And so this is what we're doing here. Like either use it directly for line, for variable in open, and then print that, save it in a variable, whatever you want to do it. Just remember read and read line, we have to be a little cautious because then we have to go and close our file again and again. But then it's fine. We know that there is this way of like opening it and getting the contents of the file. All right, so this is how we read the contents of a file usually when writing a program. Just go and use the open function and then make sure that your file is saved either in your working directory or you've specified the path of the file, and that's it. You're good to go. All right. I think I talked about like f.close whenever. It's a good practice to kind of at the end of your code you do f.close because you've opened the file. But again, if you miss that, I don't think this is going to impact because I'm not using read or read line. So if you're not using it, it's fine, but the convention is to go and use the dot close. Uh, Also, we can write into files. I don't know if we have that example just yet. Okay, let's first look at this example, then I can talk about like how to write into files. So this is a nice example how to work with a txt file, and most likely this is the type of code that we'll be writing throughout. And so I remember this problem. I have the code here. Sorry, I have the text file here. Now notice that we have these scores of, I think, a student scores, sequence of integers representing test scores. So there is one score per line. And what we have to do is write a program that computes the average of these scores. All right. So what we have to do is read this. Now we know how to calculate the average. We've done that multiple times. But the new thing about this thing is that we are now using a txt file. We're now using data in a txt file to do that. Okay, so let's see what we have to do. And there are a few things that I'm going to emphasize a lot, which will be helpful when you're submitting your code on the homework as well. So the first thing that we need to do is usually we read the file name. So we ask the user for the file name. Let me do that. So I'll say enter the name of the file. And whenever you're doing that, going forward, always use a dot strip with it, or I'll show you another way. Once you have the file name, like update it with like a dot strip. Either way is fine. So this is file name dot strip, or you could have done it like right here. Use a dot strip right here. Now, why are we doing that? Well, like we test your code on Submity also using these different variations. So let's say the user is entering the name of the file and they introduce some space on that line, which is like beyond your control. And so the name of the file will not be correct and your code will not be able to pick up that exact file. So it's always a good practice to kind of go and do a dot strip. And we're going to like print it as well, just to make sure. Although this is not something that's required, but you know that on Submity you need to do that. So I'm doing that anyways. Now coming back to the problem. The problem is asking us to calculate the average. One way of doing that is to go and get each of the scores here in a loop, because this is going to be that line variable in this txt file, right? So keep getting that and then saving it in some accumulator variable, and then maybe counting the number of times we count, like get each of the lines, right? And then dividing it, the sum, like divide the sum by the number of these scores, right? So let's try doing that. And let me save this thing. Okay. So the first thing that I'm doing is num scores equals 0, just initializing it. So this is the counter, and sum scores equals 0. This is the accumulator variable. And I'm going to do whatever we did just now, right? So for some variable in my file name. Okay, so here's the thing. Now I'm going to get the sum of every S, every element in this, right? So let me do that. Sum scores plus equals S. Now, do you think this is going to like work the way we want it to work, or is it going to give us some issue here? This is an important part because this is reading every value in my scores file, and that value is a number, of course. But what might go wrong here? Do you see anything that's going wrong here? And why? Rochelle, uh, Rochelle, you're right. Yeah, so it's a string. And so when we are reading it, yeah, and Kiran, you're also right. So Jake, your confusion is right, but no. What I'm doing here is I'm saying for S in file name, that means read every line from my file, right? So every line is a 75. It's not 7 and 5. So it's not splitting it in any like in any way. Right, Lennis, you're right. So if I don't like do this, and this won't concatenate, by the way, it's going to like error out, because this operator plus equals is not for concatenation. So I don't think it's going to concatenate, or maybe it will. I don't remember the top of my head, but it's going to error out. As far as I can tell, it's going to error out. And so that's why we have to convert it to an integer, because I'm using some operator that works with numbers only. And I know that whenever I'm reading some input from a file, it's always of the string type. And let me write it down. Input from a txt file is a string type. You're going to get these errors initially when you start working with files, because you will be assuming that it's a number type. Actually, it's not. Why? Because it is a string type. Although we know that it's a number, but actually it's not. All right, so this is plus equals 1. Why? Because this is just like a counter, right? And then finally come out and print the average score is going to be like sum scores divided by num scores. All right, let's try running it. And if we encounter some error, then we can like try to fix it. Let me run it this way without saving it. So it's scores.txt. All right, so here we are getting some issue. What exactly is the issue? Invalid literal for integer. That is strange. Plus equals int s. All right, that's an excellent error. How can we forget this, right? It's not even opening that. So it's like literally reading the scores.txt. So it's like, okay, what is this? Great. It's always good to get errors in class. So this is it, right? We get this output, which is like nothing but the average. Of course, you can have like a nice print statement here, like and round it or print it up to certain significant values. The important part here is again using this integer. If this integer wasn't here, then it would have like given you some error again saying that this operator does not work with string type because the numbers, of course, they are numbers to us, but actually they are not numbers, they're always string type. So this goes back to many of the problems that you will encounter in future. You will be given files that have data, and of course that data has some numbers, but you will have to figure out that these are number types, and so they should be read in and utilized as number types. So you might have to convert them to float or int, depending on whatever your application is. All right, let's take questions. Lauren, that's a good question. Yes, I can use read line, not exactly read, and open to get the same output. But usually it's better to just like stick with this because we don't want to do the dot close again and again. That's what I said earlier, right? So of course you can use dot read. Yes. And like, please feel free to use it if you feel more comfortable with that. But I feel that this is like more of a like more convenient kind of syntax. So again, it's up to you, but you can definitely use that. Remember, when you're testing it again and again, it becomes tedious to close it. Maybe have a statement like f dot close, and then like do not forget that. But yeah, you can use it, of course. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Yeah, and so I cannot like emphasize more the use of dot strip because when I'm reading this file here, and especially on Submiti, I have these test cases when I explicitly go ahead and add spacing to the name of the file when it's reading the name of the file. And so if you're not using dot strip, your code is going to error out. So make this a habit of using dot strip whenever you are like reading any string type or with text files usually. So when you start working with text files, make it a habit of using this dot strip always. And one of the examples is homework 4 part 1, where you like many of you are getting a different output, and that's because you're not using dot strip. Jonathan, your question is what kind of object is file name? What do you mean object? File name is a string type. That's why we can use dot strip. Well, that's a good question. The fact that we can use a dot strip is a method for string. And so it's reading the string type, right? And so that's why we can use dot strip. All right, so that's that. Any other questions? All right, one thing that we didn't talk about is these two additional modes. Although I don't remember using them at all, but these also exist. So you know that the default for this open function is read, right? And like I can specify this W as a second parameter, and that is going to be in the write mode. So this W is telling that this open is in write mode. All right, so what does that mean? Let me show you that. Let's say I have like this S equals open, and this has to be like open the way we did earlier, except that you can specify the name of your new file. And so I'm like specifying it out 2021. Most likely I have other out files from my previous lectures, .txt. And then of course you have to specify the extension. We will be working with .txt files only, so that's it, .txt, it's a text file. And then this is in write mode. So this is a W, right? And so let me do that. And so what I'm telling it to do is go and open this in write mode and let me run this. All right, it got executed, which means it got created. And let me see if it got created or not. And I said out, it should be here because this is my, hey, that's strange. Oops, I'm sorry. Here. It should have been created here. Okay, here. Okay, all right. Took me forever to find out. Okay, out 2021, and it's a txt file. Excellent. So it got created exactly in this place here. Okay, so having done that, it doesn't have any content. So how do we add contents there? One way to do that is to use .write on my variable, which is S. So I can do s dot write. And what do you want to write? So well, you can specify the strings here, which is let's say hello world. Right, so that's it. And then you can also specify any space characters, but basically it has to be like the contents have to be in the form of a string. And you can have like multiple strings as well. And that's absolutely fine. And so if you're doing hello world, and let me just execute this, it is going to give you an output. As you can see, 11. It is telling me that it wrote 11 characters in your out 2021.txt file because I did s.write hello world. All right, let me go and check back again, out 21. It doesn't have anything yet, right? Although I executed my dot write. And so I need to do something else before I can see the contents here. So right now what it's in this mode, it's still in the dot write mode until I go ahead and do something like this, s dot close. So when I do this, s dot close, and then I go back and check the contents of my file, I can see the contents here, hello world. All right, one thing to remember when using dot write is that when you're going to open it like again and do a dot write again on this like file, the previous contents of your file will be removed if you're doing a dot write, like if you're doing it in the write mode. So next time, if you want to retain the contents and still write something else in that file, you'll have to do a dot a, which means dot append, and it works exactly in the same way as your append works with your lists. So it's going to append whatever contents you're specifying. So now when you open it in append mode, it's going to retain the earlier contents and then start writing after that. So you can go ahead and try experimenting with the dot append as well. Sorry, dot like a mode as well, which means append. And if you're using W again, it will allow you to write, but the previous contents will be gone. So it depends on how you want to use it. But before you want to see the contents in both cases, you will have to close the file and then they will be visible. Because until then, it's in that write mode. Right, so this is what this section 24.7 talks about, writing to a file, two ways, W and A. Just remember that this file is going to be created in your working directory, and or you can specify the entire path wherever you want it to be created. All right, so yeah, so this we already talked about, and yeah, this is like a small thing, but maybe you can always use a \n whenever you are writing contents into a file. Why? Because let's say you want to append something later on, it will get appended right after the end of that hello world, and maybe you want like things to be appended on the next line next time. So either you specify \n here, or when you're writing the contents again, right, specify \n in the beginning of that line. Either ways, it should work fine. Okay, so this was this part. Let us move. I'm skipping this part because I think most of you will be able to do it yourself. So let's move on to opening static web pages. And what are these like static web pages and why are we talking about them? Well, most of the web pages that you work with, that you see around you, are dynamic web pages, which means that the data on them is continuously changing. And so it is beyond the scope of this course to work with those dynamic web pages. And so that's why we're working with static web pages. These are some kind of web pages where some data is available, and we just want to extract that data from there, mostly like a TXT file, except that it's on the web. Just like we did with the TXT file on our computers, we can get the same data from the web using some additional libraries, right? So let's look at this example here. First of all, let me talk through this URL lib.request. So URL lib is that library that helps us extract information from some static website. And as I said, for the dynamic websites, the process is a slightly more complicated one in the sense that we need to use some APIs, of course, not something impossible, but we are not like working with them, at least in this course. So let's focus on this. So URL lib.request is going to request this particular website to give us the data essentially. And then we can save it just like we did with the TXT files. We can save it in in a variable and then work with it. Let's look at this one specifically because we know that this one here, this think Python green tea press is a static one. It doesn't change. So all it has is like some words and we are going to use them. Oops. I just wanted to copy this. All right. So first, let me execute this URL lib.request. You're familiar with this kind of import now. This is like library dot function within that. So let me import that. That got imported. And then here, notice this is nothing but a variable that has the name of the URL. You could have directly like copied this string in this here. Now let's see what this is doing. I'm using URL lib.request, which I just imported, and using one function in that dot request, which is URL open. Now, instead of using this open word directly, within this library, the way you open the contents of that static web page is by using this function, URL open. That's all. That's all. Like in addition to open, you have this URL. That's it. And then specify the URL here, right? And similar to like my files, I'm just saving it in some file name, which is Word file, right? So let me execute this. Okay, notice it took like a few seconds because there was a lot of data, and now it is there in my Word file variable. Now the question arises, how do we use it? Well, you can use it exactly the same way as we use my txt files. For example, let me show you for some variable, just like we did with the txt file, right? For variable in my Word file, right? Let me just like go and print line. Let's try doing this. I know that it's a lot of data, so we might want to like stop it at some point. Oops. Why did that happen? Okay, maybe because there is some weird, my connection is throwing some weird error again and again. Maybe it didn't get there, but it should work. Yeah, now you can see all the words that are there. Okay, I'll have to stop because it will go on and on. But these are all the words with the space characters as well. And so this is similar to what we did. So these are the space characters, and there are ways to get rid of like these. But this is essentially telling me that I'm reading like the contents of whatever was saved here, right? This is a quick example to show that I had to stop it because it can go on and on. There's like a lot of data in there. But it is similar when we are reading from when we are reading from external files that are saved on my computer, or I'm reading from a static web page. Except that we have to use these additional libraries. And in fact, you will see like going forward, maybe in your other courses, you'll see that these APIs are not that hard to use these days. They make our life like really, you can actually get all the Twitter data and work with it. So it's not that difficult. It's hardly like a few lines of code. But again, it's outside the scope of this course, so we are not um, uh, doing that. And similar to like the for line in word file print line, we can use these functions as well. So you can go ahead and try these read line and close methods, just like you did with the ordinary files. So that's how we work with static web pages. All right. Moving on, let me see if there are questions. Otherwise, Kiran, your question is, can you go over dot append? Well, just try doing, instead of W, just try doing an A, right? Exactly like this. Open the file in append mode. So when you open a file in append mode, whatever you have, so you'll have to open it again. After closing it, open it again, and then do a dot write on that. Just like we did dot W, like just the way we did W, you can do an append on that. Right. So the important, very important section, and this parsing is going to stay with us for a long time, I would say. And what is parsing? So parsing is reading a data file or web page, right? And of course, we know how to read a web page now. We know how to read from a data file now. But there are certain known file formats. And because we know that these are known file formats, we can structure our code in a certain format. We can structure our pseudocode, or we can have the pseudocode already ready just by looking at the file format. And that's what parsing is. Parsing means I know that this data is maybe stored in this kind of a format, and so this is the way to deal with it. Versus if it's saved in some other format, this is the way to deal with it. That's what parsing essentially means. And of course, we will be working with .txt files only. So we need to understand how to, like, different ways of working with .txt files only. However, there are other file formats as well. And so we quickly review those, although we don't use them in the course, but this is just like extra information for you all to just be aware that parsing can involve any of these as well. So the first one I think is okay because this is Python code, and the moment you look at Python code, you should be able to identify that this is Python code, and so most likely saved in a .py file, and this is how we read it, right? So this should be, you should be familiar with that. Sometimes data can come up in like C++ code. There are APIs in Python that help us like decode that, or you'll have to go and run that as it is. Then we have something that's known as HTML, or hypertext markup language, that's used in web pages most of the times. And so this is nothing, but I'm going to show you how this looks like. So whenever you encounter this type of data, you know that this is HTML format. And so based on that, you can look for the tools that you require to kind of parse it, because the tools that we will be using in this course are only for TXT files. So when you see any other format, you'll have to go and get those essential tools in order to like parse this type of file, HTML. Then there is another one that's like widely used now, and in fact we use it a lot when doing your rainbow grades and other information. So that's JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. It's a very common, as I said, data exchange format, and we'll see a small kind of format of that, like an example of that, I would say. And then there is this resource description framework, which we are not touching in this course at all. So that's RDF. But the whole point of this section is to tell you that, again, depending on the data format, we write the parser. Parser is nothing but the code that reads it in and then manipulates it depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. All right. So as I said, short tour of these data formats, but I wouldn't go into a ton of detail because we would hardly be using them. But if you're familiar with them, that makes things easier for you. I think in one of the homeworks, we do ask you to use the JSON format, but we provide the relevant code that's required to use them. So of course, Python, you know how Python works. Each statement on a separate line, indentation and all that should exist, otherwise it's going to error out. HTML is something that's nothing but tags. So I would call HTML also like some kind of a string format. And it looks something like this, like these are the tags that are kind of telling us the, I would say, hierarchy of where to start and where to stop. But this in HTML, whenever you see these tags, this like greater than, less than sign, you should know that this is HTML and this is how this looks like. If you go to a web page and just like go to the source, tools, source, you can see this HTML format there. And there is no difference between this kind of an HTML versus this kind, because the way this is read is only by these tags. So it has nothing to do with like what comes in every line. Okay, coming to the JSON, as I said, JSON looks something like this. So as I said, we save your data, student data on submittee using JSON, and it looks something like this. Like for example, class name, and then every class. So this is like a hierarchical structure, more like when we go to dictionaries in Python, you'll be able to identify this better. So more like the class name is this, and then the subsections, for example, lab sections, and then the details of that is this, right? So section 1 and then section 2. So similar to that, we can have like class name, CSCI 1100, student name, whatever that is, and then their details, and name 2, and then their details, and so on. So that kind of data is usually saved in JSON files. Again, spacing in HTML and JSON does not matter. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that you might see going forward, like using this module, import JSON, and you don't have to do much. All you'll be doing is like go and import JSON, and then you'll be given some data that's in the form of JSON. Just do a JSON.loads, and this is going to be converted to a list. And of course, as I said, if ever I ask you to do that, I will provide the code, which is like 3 to 4 lines. But essentially, it deals with importing JSON and then converting it to a list. And so the functions within the JSON module help you do that. You don't have to write your own code for that. All right. So then this was like a quick review of some of the more common data formats that are available. And then you might get data in any of these formats. And based on that, you'll write your parser. Now, in today's class, we are going to write parser for 2 different types of .txt file data formats. And what are those? Okay, so parsing ad hoc data formats. there are two types of data formats that we will be working with. The first one is regular tabular data. Now, what is this regular tabular data? And I think I have this data with me. Let me quickly check. Yeah, this one here. Yeah. So this is regular tabular data. It means you have like on every line the same number of elements on each line, and they're like maybe separated by a delimiter. So in this case, the delimiter is the comma, and the number of like elements on each line are the same. So this is like the name of a soup, and I think the problem talks about it. So what we're doing is we're working with this file. This is a txt file. Each line has the name of a soup and the number of cans that are available for that. And we're working with a very simple problem because just like two entries. Okay, so whenever you come across this regular tabular data, there is this existing pseudo code that you should be using. The moment you look at data, you know that this is the way I should be processing my file. Let's see how this happens. So, like read the file, of course, all of that is included. And then for each line of the file, so basically this is like for line in open, whatever the name of the file, and then go and split it. Now, notice this. If I split every line by a comma, what do you think this is creating? Let's say I read this line and then do a dot split by comma. What is this creating? A list. Huey, excellent. Rochelle, that's correct. Whoever is saying is a list, that's right. Now, so this is the pseudocode for that. Go and split it into a list using this delimiter, which is comma in my case, right? And once I have that list, I know this is regular tabular data, which means after looking at the data, I can tell that the name of the soup is the first element, right? So I can index it at 0, and the number of cans is the second element, so I can index it at 1 and use that always, right? So once I have that, I can like process the entries of the list into the desired form because I know how to index them because I know I have a list. Okay, so let's look at this like practice problem where we write a simple parser, and parser is nothing but the code to read in like some data format in and work with it. So what we have to do is write a simple parser for the soup list that returns a list of this form. So why is it returning a list of this form? Chicken noodle is 2 times and this is 3 times. Okay, so basically repeat, based on the number of cans, repeat the name of the soup. Let's try doing that. This is important because you'll be using this a lot. All right, so the first thing is just read in the name of the file. And so I'm naming it soup name. And let me just move this a little bit. Soup name equals input, always enter the name of the file. And that's it. And remember, never forget dot strip because we don't know how the user is going to enter the file name. And so always take care of that. Now, what I'm trying to do here is I have to create a list, right? I have to create this list, and maybe I can append or somehow concatenate the elements of my file to that list, right? And then output it. So maybe create an empty list here for that. So soup underscore list equals this empty list because I'm going to put the elements here, depending on like whatever the values they have. All right. Now this line is important. For line in open and then soup name, right? Soup name is the name of the file. So open that file and go inside it. But now I know that there is a delimiter. This is regular tabular data. So what I have to do is maybe a new variable. I don't know, maybe line 1 is better. Usually people use line equals line dot split. I try to use another variable to avoid any kind of confusion, right? So it's up to you what you want to do. Line dot split and go and split by this comma, right? So what it's going to do is in every line, it's going to create that list, remember, with the elements. And so I need the soup and the count, right? So let me get the soup. Soup is what element of my line? What element of my line is the soup name? Excellent, yes. So line 1 and 0, because I know that this is the data format, right? So line 1 at index 0 is the name of the soup. That's simple. And I cannot like emphasize more, always use .strip when dealing with string type data, because we might have spaces introduced here as well. As you can see, this number 2 and like other things. So it could have been like an extra space after the comma or before the comma. So that's why I'm using .strip. So that's the name of the soup. And then what we need is like count. So maybe count equals, and this everybody remembers because this is a number. So I'm converting it into int, and you can tell this is line 1. Sorry, it has to be at index 1, and this is line 1 because line 1 has the list. Okay, so in every line, I'm going to get the name of the soup and the count, and I have to put this. So basically multiply my soup with the count. So it will be repeated that many times, right? So for example, chicken soup times 2 is chicken noodle times 2 is going to repeat it, right? But then I have to figure out a way to, of course, like, because that is going to be a string, sorry, a list in itself, right? And so I have to figure out a way to not create these sub lists, because I might create a list of lists if I do a dot append. So one way to deal with that is to go and do something like this. Soup list, keep updating soup list with whatever the soup list is, which of course in my case, like in my very first iteration, is nothing. It's an empty list, so that's fine. So soup list plus the name of the soup created as a list, and I'm going to show you like an example why we are doing this, times count, right? And if you've forgotten, like most of you should be able to figure out why we are doing that, because if I do something like, okay, let me finish my code first before we jump into this detail. Okay, let's say I have something like this. X is an empty list, right? That's fine. And then let's assume I have some list with some element, XYZ times 2, right? And this is saved in like my Y. Okay, right? So what is Y? Y is this. Okay, this is good. Now, if I go ahead and do X dot append Y, and let's see what happened to X. Right, it creates this like list of list, which we don't want, because like my problem is saying don't have a list of lists, but have these. So that's why I'm doing this, right? So like that's all fine, leave it. Let's execute this to see if we get what we wanted. All right, so the name of the file is soup.txt. All right, so this is what we wanted, right? So this was reading in regular tabular data. Now, the second example that we're looking at is the irregular tabular data. And this is clear to everyone, right? John, that's a very good question. You're saying, do we need to do a strip here? Well, int takes care of that when we have spaces, but it won't hurt if you would like to do that, but int takes care of that. Yeah, in this case. All right, so moving on to irregular tabular data. And this is one of the Yelp files. I think you have it in case you don't have it, because from the Yelp lab, if you don't have it, I can provide that. I can put it on the course under course materials on Submiti. But let's look at what this file looks like. So this has restaurant information. I'm sure you remember it from the Yelp restaurant lab. Right? So this is irregular tabular data. Why is this irregular? Because although like every line has a restaurant name and then their location, latitude, longitude, and address and other things like the website, but notice in the end it has these numbers, which are the ratings given by customers. And they cannot be of the same number on every line, because like some restaurants have ratings, some don't have, some have more, some have less. And so this is irregular tabular data. Why? Because every line has like similar information, so that makes it tabular. But then some of the information is specific to that particular line. And so there is a different way to parse this type of data, as we'll see. Let me show you. So in order to like parse this type of data, usually we have a nested for loop. And why is that? Well, for the outer for loop, everything is the same, just like we did with the regular tabular data, like go and read every line, go and split it by the separator, which in this case is going to be this pipe delimiter, right? I can see that the data is delimited by that, so I'm going to separate it by that. And then what I'm going to get is like one of the elements is still going to be like these, and these are like the ratings that we have to do something with. And so for that particular part of the list, I'll have to go and write like another sort of for loop to do something with that. So usually what we have to do is we have to write two for loops, one with the first like splitting, and then split the entry with the secondary like separator. Sometimes there might be two. For instance, we'll see one example where we are splitting this address sometimes. So the pseudocode somehow stays the same. And we're going to see that in this like last example that we're looking at today. So the practice problem is asking us to write a function that returns a list of lists for a file containing Yelp data. Each list should contain the name of the restaurant and the average review. Now you can tell the average review is not that easy to calculate because in every line I'm going to get all these elements. And so I have to get, like, I have to do something with those essentially, right? So let's try writing that. Okay, so I'm going to copy this line. I don't want to write it again and again. Okay, so, and what we're doing is I'm trying to be consistent with the code that's posted on the course website. So let's write a function for that. And this will also give you an idea of how to like write functions when reading in files. So the function is Yelp averages, and the input is some file name. And so I can write, I can call that file name whenever I'm using it. So just a generic like variable essentially. Okay, and I have, as usual, a list because I need a list at the end, averages. And this is going to have like every restaurant and the average of that restaurant. So that's the averages list. Okay, for line in open file name, right? The first thing that I'm going to do is similar to what we did with regular tabular data. I'm going to split by the delimiter. So line one, of course, you can do line equals line, as I said earlier, because this is just like a local variable for that iteration, but I try to use more variables and split by this delimiter. Okay, that's line one. Now, what do we need out of this list that's created? I just need the name and the scores, right? So I'll just have two variables, name equals line 1 0 dot strip, just to be sure, right? And then scores, I'm going to like deal with scores and the spacing within the inner loop. So for now, all I'm doing is pick the scores. And how do I pick the scores, by the way? Now, let me go back to the data and see. The first element is the name, then the latitude, longitude, the address, and then the website and the type. And so the, like, if we index them, right, this element begins at index 6. And then you may or may not have anything in the end, right? So one way of doing that is to use the slicing operator. So all I have to do is do line 1 and then slice it starting from 6 until the end. So if there is something, it's going to pick that up. Otherwise, this is going to be an empty list, right? And I know we have to deal with that as well. What if this is an empty list? So I will just like get rid of it here before doing anything else. So if this is an empty list, what should I do? If len of scores, right, equals 0, this is how we deal mostly with empty list. Averages dot append, just the name of this, the like, I do need the name, and these have to be a list of lists. So I can explicitly go ahead and introduce that, the name of the restaurant, right? And then just include a -1. And this is up to us. Like I'm using a -1 so that like whoever sees the output, they know that this restaurant does not have anything, does not have like ratings. Otherwise, we will have to go and get those ratings. And the way to do the average is get the accumulator variable, get the length of the list, and that's it, right? So let me do that. Sum scores equals 0. This is my accumulator variable, and let me just name it this. And for S in, this is simple, for S in scores, remember scores is also a list with all those averages, except that this is like every element in that is a string type. So I'll have to like make sure that I'm converting it to an integer type, and that will take care of my spacing as well. Okay, so now notice what's happening here. My scores is a list of all the scores starting from the sixth element until the end, right? And so I'm iterating over that smaller list of numbers. And so that's why I'm doing for SN scores, accumulate all those scores in this. So that's going to be the sum. And then come out of this loop, obviously, and calculate the average. And the average can be calculated by sum scores, right? Divided by LEN scores, right? Once I have the average, I have to put that in the averages list. So I'm going to do an append just like I did earlier. Averages dot append, and then a list name and the average that I just calculated, which is this. Right, this looks okay to me. All right, so that's all we need. Come out of the loop, return averages, whatever that is, right? And so this is like the function that takes in a file name, and notice like 2 for loops depending on our application, and just return that list of lists that has the names of the restaurants and their average rating. All right, let's work with the driver code, like how to use this, obviously. So this, you can tell, this is a huge file, right? It has, I don't know, like so many lines of data, and I don't want to output everything, which is why I wrote a function. One way to deal with that is, let me create a variable a equals, call this function yelp underscore averages, and then provide the file name. Now, because this is the driver code, provide the actual file name, which is yelp.txt. I think this is the name. Let me check. Yes. So yelp.txt, that A is going to have like the entire list, which is going to be huge. And I don't want to print all of that. So what I'm going to do is just like slice that, maybe 0 up to 5, just like 5 elements. I think that should be fine. So let's actually try doing this. All right, so this is what we wanted, right? A list of lists with the name of the restaurant and the average. And of course, we could have like rounded the average here when we were calculating this here. We could have done round up to 2 decimal places or anything that's more convenient to us. Well, that all of that is fine. The important point being, when you're working with irregular tabular data, when every line does not have the same information, most likely you will be using a code like this. Of course, with the updates that you require for the problem that you're solving, but the overall format is going to be similar to this one, where you have the outer for loop, which is used to read every line, convert it to a list by doing a dot split by the delimiter. And then the next is, you will be working with some part of the data which is not the same for every line, which is why this data is irregular. And so you'll have another for loop to deal with that irregular tabular data. And this is what this pseudocode tells us here. And if you're like 100% of the time, I think, except like when we are using JSON files, we will be working with either regular tabular data or irregular tabular data. So you know how to deal with that. Either use this pseudocode or use this pseudocode, and you should be fine. Except that you'll have to do like a little bit of tweaking here depending on the problem that you're solving. All right, questions, doubts before we end today's lecture? Okay, so in order to like just end the lecture, in order to summarize, this is one of the important lectures. Why? Because we'll be using this reading in of txt files and working with it a lot. Even when we start working with dictionaries and sets, you will see that we'll be reading in data from files and working with that. So that's important. Remember the important string operations, because the txt data, the file, the data that comes into these files and then we read it and work with it, is in the form of strings. And so we should remember, review all the string operations, especially the ones that we did today. Remember to use the dot strip whenever reading data from files or whenever reading user input. And then parsing file requires the understanding of the format. Always remember, it's important before you start writing your parser, make sure that you understand what's the file format, the way it's stored in, because depending on that, you're going to write your code. And we'll practice, like in future labs and homework assignments, this parsing, and most likely we'll be working with either regular tabular data or irregular tabular data. So that's it from my end. If you have questions, you can stay back. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining, everyone. Thank you.